The following is a recording of a live questions and answers session with Chris McCann that took place on Friday, June 3rd, 2016.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a pre-recorded eBible Fellowship's Questions and Answers time. This program is designed to interact with you with your questions and comments related to the Bible, and we'll try to respond as well as possible by going to the Bible. And so, with our Bibles at the ready, it's now time to turn things over to our speaker for this pre-recorded questions and answers time, and say hello to Chris McCann.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to eBible Fellowship's Friday night question and answer program. Tonight, we're going to take a look at the Bible with any questions or comments that anyone may have, and each person is invited to share what's ever on your mind by contacting us in one of the ways that were just mentioned, and we'll be glad to take your call. And I'll try to respond as much as possible by going to the Bible, as the Bible is God's holy word, and it is there that we are to look and, by God's grace, find answers to our spiritual questions. Well, we only have a short time together tonight, so we're going to get started right away by going to the first person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Yes. First, I'd like to say your questions and answers page hasn't been updated since April, and my question is in Daniel chapter 12.
Okay. Daniel 12. And which verse?
I don't know the number of the verse. The verse that says, "Many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake." I want to know what that sentence means spiritually.
Daniel 12 and verse 2 says, "And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." This verse is telling us about the resurrection, and God does speak of the resurrection of the just and of the unjust in John chapter 5, where he says in verse 29, well, I'll start reading in verse 28, "Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, in the which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation." And that's saying the same thing that Daniel 12:2 is saying, that many sleep in the dust of the earth. And the Bible identifies sleep with death. So many people have died, and they're sleeping in death. And when the time of resurrection comes, some will awake to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now, of course, we have to take everything the Bible has to say about the resurrection into consideration when we read a verse like this. And the rest of the Bible tells us that when man dies physically and he's unsaved, that he ceases to exist in his soul existence, and his body goes into the ground, but he doesn't have a conscience existence after that. And so on the last day, the final day of Earth's existence, when God will destroy the world, and it's the time of the resurrection, God will raise up the bodies, or what's ever left of the unsaved dead. Could just be ashes or molecules of whatever they were. Perhaps they've been dead so long. And whatever it is, God will raise it up to shame and everlasting contempt. And since they're coming up out of the ground, It's as though they have risen or waken in that sense of rising, because when you wake, you rise. And although it does not mean they have any sort of awareness of any kind, that's not possible. They rise in whatever is left of their body to be destroyed. And then their physical remains are destroyed as their spirit was upon the day of their death. And so that's what's in view here. But thank you for calling and sharing. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Thank you. I would like to know what the word cross means in Mark chapter 8, verse 34.
Mark 8 and verse 34. And when he had called the people unto him with his disciples also, he said unto them, Whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Well, that's a good question, because the Bible tells us to take up our cross. And in Luke, I think it says to take it up daily. And we know that we do not take up a literal cross. The Lord Jesus did bear a literal cross. He was nailed to a literal cross. And we follow his example, and so God says, whosoever will come after me must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And really, when we analyze it and we look at all the Bible has to say about it, we find that Jesus' cross was ultimately doing the will of the Father. He came to do what the Father had sent him to do. And the period of his ministry was a part of that. But the Father's will was for Jesus to suffer a second time, yet without sin, and to demonstrate the things he had done from the foundation of the world, and to die. Here's what it says concerning Christ's death in Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. And then the Lord says, ye have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. And Jesus took up the cross without sin. He was spotless, sinless, the perfect Lamb of God. And so God commands us, be therefore perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Keep my commandments. Do my will. Daily, God commands us to do his will. And we can be sure, whenever we do the will of God, what typically happens, or what will be the result? There will be opposition. There will be affliction. There is persecution for the word's sake. And so Christ did the Father's will. He came to do it, and he accomplished it, and he went to the cross. We are called to walk in his steps, and today, God would, part of the cross for a child of God depends on our situation. If we're a housewife, part of taking up our cross is to love our husband, to submit to him, to never think of divorce. And even though there might be trouble in that marriage, we might even be married to an unsaved man. Or if we're a son or a daughter, taking up the cross is to honor our parents. And, there's many other commands. If we're an employee, we may be taken advantage of to some degree at work, and yet we do not get with all the other employees and speak badly about the bosses, but instead we work heartily as to the Lord. They're just little bits of God's direction for us, his commandments for us. He tells us what to do when Sunday, the Lord's Day, rolls around. And the more we do the will of God, the more we desire and are able to keep his commandments, there will typically be those that are contrary and opposition. It may be, for instance, that as someone seeks to do God's will concerning Sunday, well, guess what? Now the company we work for that never worked on the weekend now wants a 24/7 operation, and they want everyone in on Sunday. Well, see, this is part of just an example of the affliction that could come. And so now we're confronted with a situation. Do we perhaps suffer? It could even be financial suffering. It could be really a big problem, if we're not able to work on Sunday and the company insists we do, and it could affect our livelihood and our bills and all kinds of things. Or do we give in? Do we say, well, I'll take up my cross in another area, and instead I'm going to compromise, and I'm going to do what the company wants me to do, and I'm going to play it safe and not risk my income and paying the bills. And you see, and then it was a test for us, and it can show us our failure and our weakness, and maybe even get us to wonder, am I really a child of God? If, here is an opportunity to serve the Lord and to do his will, and I did not. And that's just one of many examples. There's numerous ones, but there's no one answer for any one of us. It's the whole Bible as God brings it into our life and how it affects each one of us, doing it God's way or doing it the world's way or our own way will determine whether we're taking up our cross or not. Actually, here in Mark chapter 8, notice what it goes on to say in verse 35. For whosoever will save his life, just think of the example I just gave. Someone's thinking, hey, I can't do it God's way. I'll lose my job. I can't pay my bills. They're thinking of saving themselves by not doing the will of God and by continuing to work. Well, all right. Whosoever will save his life shall lose it. But whosoever shall lose his life for my sake and the gospel's, the same shall save it. For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? Whosoever therefore shall be ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him also shall the Son of Man be ashamed when he cometh in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And of course, this relates to the end of the church age teaching. Now some are ashamed of that. Some want to return to the church. And they're not taking up their cross in that regard. And so forth.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for calling and sharing. And I think we have a question on Pal Talk. Let's take that question. The question is, how can we know that the four horsemen in Revelation are pointing to God's warning to the churches? Well, let's take a look at Revelation chapter 6, where we read about four horsemen. And actually, the four horsemen here are speaking about different things. For instance, there's the first horse in verse 2, the white horse that goes forth, and it's a picture of the Lord Jesus Christ going forth, conquering and to conquer, a picture of the gospel that goes out into the world victoriously, and it's followed by a red horse, and the rider on the red horse seeks to take peace from the earth, and Christ is peace. So the red is a color that identifies with Satan. It's Satan that is being contrary. He's set against the gospel as it goes forth. And then in verse 5, and when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, or third living creature, come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts, or four living creatures, say, a measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. The black horse, considering the language here, the pair of balances and the language or reference to a measure of wheat and 3 measures of barley, relates to the gospel that is impacted during the Great Tribulation. And the Great Tribulation is the time when God began the judgment on the corporate church, the churches and congregations of the world. And when God began that judgment within the church, we're still elect. It wasn't until later on that the Lord opened up his word and the understanding of his people to it, that we were to come out of the church. And so the command is to bring the judgment on the congregations, but hurt not the oil and the wine. It's similar to Ezekiel chapter 9, when the men go forth with destroying weapons, and God says, begin at my sanctuary. But then he says, well, what's he say? Hurt not any that have the mark. In Ezekiel 9, in verse 5, and to the others he said in mine hearing, go ye after him through the city, and smite. Let not your eyes spare, neither have ye pity. Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women. But come not near any man upon whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. Then they began at the ancient men which were before the house. The ones with the mark would be their father's mark, the mark in their foreheads that Revelation mentions elsewhere, that indicates their souls, they're bought with a price, they're bondmen of the Lord Jesus Christ, and so they're not to be slain. And it's the same thing with the command, the rider on the black horse, hurt not the oil and the wine, and the oil and the wine would be the fruits of a harvest. And fruit points to those that are brought into the kingdom of heaven, the saved of God. And then the final horse is the pale horse in verse 8. And the pale horse identifies with the final judgment, which relates to our present time. And so the four horses, really the first, we could relate to the church age, going forth, conquering to conquer, Satan, combating it, again throughout the church age, the black horse, the great tribulation that follows the church age, the pale horse, the judgment that follows the great tribulation. It's very orderly. It progresses from one stage of God's program to the next. But thank you for submitting your question. And now let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Can we relate first two horses, the white horse and the red horse, to the parable of the wheat and tares?
Well, yeah, I think that would be a good tie-in, because we know that Satan was active sowing tares amongst the wheat throughout the church age. And so if we take a look in Matthew 13, verse 24, another parable put he forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field, but while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. And so we have Christ going forth, conquering and to conquer. He's another way of looking at it, sowing the good seed. And then here comes the rider on the red horse to take peace away. Well, how's it put in the parable of the sower in Mark 4? It says in verse 14 of Mark 4, the sower soweth the word, and these are they by the wayside where the word is sown. But when they have heard, Satan cometh immediately and taketh away the word that was sown in their hearts. So in the parable of the wheat and the tares, it's the harvest or the field of planting is the battlefield. But in Revelation 6, it's picturing more of a warfare type battle with men on horses doing fighting. And so Christ is riding forth, conquering and to conquer, but Satan is after him. Satan is doing all he can to disrupt and oppose and trying his best to make sure that someone does not become saved, that God intended to be saved. And of course he was never able to accomplish that. Not even one time in all history has Satan been able to confound the gospel plan of God in preventing God in saving someone who was an elect, or in managing to take away God's salvation after God granted it to someone who was one of his elect. He's never been successful even once, but that's been the battlefield. And so Satan has settled for the corporate body, for causing trouble and bringing desolation to Israel of old, and having his people go astray and be unfaithful to God, and also within the church over the church age, taking over a church here or there, having his people rise in the ranks of hierarchy of popes and bishops and priests and ministers, and doing all he could to come against the people of God, so it could give an appearance that when a church fell away or a whole denomination fell away, or finally the whole corporate body fell away, became apostate, that Satan had won. And yet he never successfully won a single battle when the battleground was one of God's elect. He always lost. And and he was always defeated. God always successfully, victoriously saved his people and has never lost one. But thank you for calling and sharing. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Mr. McCann, could you explain the importance of 12 used in Luke 8:42 and 43?
Luke chapter 8, 42. For he had one only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she lay a-dying. But as he went, the people thronged him. And a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all her living upon physicians, neither could be healed of any. And then we know that Jesus also healed her. So obviously God is emphasizing the number 12 in this chapter when Christ saves the young girl, 12 years old, and he heals the woman who had an affliction 12 years. That's not a coincidence or an accident. It's God directing our attention to that number. And the number 12 in the Bible identifies with fullness. We actually have a lot of biblical information with the number 12 because God used it so often with the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles, and he uses it in the book of Revelation when he's speaking of the new heaven and new earth. The number 12 shows up again and again and again, and it relates to fullness. Now, the daughter, I'm not sure exactly. It would be fullness of whatever's in view. In both cases, it does point to salvation. And we do know that 12 is also identified or tied to the number 13, because the Bible teaches that the history of the world should be 12,000 years, but it actually turns out to be 13,000 years. And when we look at the Bible, we sometimes find God speaks of 120 years, as he came to Noah 120 years before the flood and commissioned him to build the ark. And that points to the fullness of time. And yet, God also speaks of 130 years, say, with Jacob and his age in entering Egypt, or Moses being 120 years when he died. And yet again, there is Jehoiada the priest, who dies at 130. So God uses 12. There were also 12 tribes of Israel, but actually 13. 12 apostles, but actually 13. He does it very consistently. And so when we see the number 12, we could think of the fullness of time or the fullness of God's salvation plan when salvation's in view, that should be completed because the world should only last 12,000 years and then have the tribulation following that, but actually 13,000. And it's at that point God completes his salvation, and that could be in view here.
Thank you.
Thank you for calling and sharing. Let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Chris, regarding the last caller's verse, could you read that again about the only daughter?
Yeah, Luke 8:42, for he had one only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she lay a-dying, but as he went, the people thronged him.
And she was eventually raised, right?
Raised from the dead, yes. Yes.
Yeah. I don't know if you can check if in your concordance, but is that only daughter tied in with only begotten?
Yeah, it's the Genesis. Yes, it is. I didn't want to mention that in this case because she was interested in the number 12. And it does relate to the monogenesis, are a few statements we find in the Gospels where a father had an only son or an only daughter who had died or symbolically died and was raised. And it does point to the raising of the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the only Son of the Father, but again, in this case, related to the 12 years of age, I'm not sure how we can understand that in relationship to Christ, who came after 11,000 years of history. So I didn't mention it.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you for calling and sharing. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. I really am enjoying the studies every night in Genesis. My question is in Joshua, chapter 14, verses 9 to 11. God mentions the number 45 in there, and I'm wondering if that has anything to do with the timeline from 19. Okay.
Yeah, I understand how you would be thinking about that. Let's take a look at Joshua 14 and verse 9. And there it says, "And Moses sware on that day, saying, Surely the land whereon thy feet have trodden shall be thine inheritance, and thy children's forever, because thou hast wholly followed Jehovah my God. And now, behold, Jehovah has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years, even since Jehovah spake this word unto Moses, while the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now, lo, I am this day 85 years old." Is this Caleb? Yeah, Caleb. If we go back to verse 7, it says, 40 years old was I when Moses, the servant of Jehovah, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to espy out the land, and I brought him word again as it was in mine heart. So it does tell us that this at this point in Joshua, they're 5 years into the conquest of the land of Canaan. And so we know the date would be, since when Caleb was 40 and went to spy out the land, that was the year 1447 BC. They had just come out of Egypt. And then 40 years later, they crossed Jordan in 1407 BC. And now 5 years after that, it's 1402 BC. And I don't know. I never noticed this number and in connection with the two places where we do find 45 in a very significant place, and one is 13 BC, the beginning, which was the 11,000th year of Earth's history. And the Bible indicates Christ would come after 11,000 years. But he did not come in 13 BC. No, there was a tribulation, 2,300 days from 13 BC brings us to 7 BC. And then Jesus came in a Jubilee year. And so 13 BC has significance as the 11,000th year of Earth's history, and also marking an initial tribulation period that would lead to the first coming of Christ. And from 13 BC to 33 AD, it is 45 actual years, because we add 13 and 33, and it totals 46. But we minus 1 because there's no year 0, and it's 45 years. And from 13 BC until Christ went to the cross in 33 AD. And it's also 45 years from 1988, which stands in a very similar way to 13 BC, because 1988 was the 13,000th year of Earth's history. And it was the beginning of the Great Tribulation, the beginning of 2,300 evening mornings that would take us to 1994 and a Jubilee year. It's really amazing how the events of the first coming of Christ identify with dates that we have had in place for some time. With 13 BC and 1988, there's strong identification. With 7 BC and 1994, strong identification. They're separated by an even space of 2,000 years, and 7 BC and 94, both Jubilee years. And from 1988 until 2033 is 45 actual years, just as there was 45 actual years from 13 BC to 33 AD. And so it really makes us wonder, is God following the same pattern? Is he repeating his second coming, following a similar timeline as the first coming, just everything separated by 2,000 years? The 13 BC and 88, 7 BC, 1994, 33 AD, and 2033 AD. And the 45 years would fit in both time frames for the first coming and second coming of Christ. So this is something to take a closer look and see if there is a possibility that it might tie in to either Christ's first coming or possibly to the second coming. But thank you for bringing up this verse and for calling and sharing. And let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Yesterday there was a lesson on Genesis 6, and we were talking about Noah and the 120 years. I noticed that from 33 AD to 2033 is 2,040 years inclusively, and the numbers multiplied there are 17 times 120. I don't know if you ever saw that before.
I'm sorry, can you repeat what's your starting point from 33 AD?
33 AD to 2033 is 2,040 years inclusively, which is broken down into 17 times 120.
No, I don't think that's correct. 33 AD to 2033 is 2,000 years even.
Yeah, my mistake. 7 BC, my mistake.
Right. From
7, yes.
Yeah, from 7 BC to 2033 is 2040.
Right.
And what? How's that break down?
17 times 120.
Oh, okay. Well, that's interesting. I never noticed that before. Well, thank you for sharing that.
I don't know if you had ever seen that, and I never heard you mention it. So.
No, I never had heard of that before. I never heard Mr. Camping mention that either. Well, thank you for sharing.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
All right, let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Thanks, Chris. We know the exact starting point and finishing point for the 2300 evening mornings from 1988 to 1994. Can you go into more detail about the 2300 evening mornings from 13 BC to Christ coming and probably the Feast of it was the Feast of Atonement, I think, around October.
Well, no, I can, and I think that's a good area to look into. We should do that. What we would have to do is just work backwards, because we can't know. At least we don't know at this point the date for creation. We don't know what month, and so we couldn't know when exactly 11,000 years was completed, and 2,300 evening days from there. So we have to work back. The way to do it would be to start in 7 BC, when Christ was born. When he was born, we know, well, there's strong evidence. It's not absolute, but there's strong evidence he was born on the Day of Atonement in the Jubilee year. So we know it was October 1st or October 2nd, somewhere around there, and that could be our starting point. We work backwards, and we would come to an actual date in 13 BC that was 2,300 days earlier. Yes, that is something that I think needs to be done at some point. But thank you for calling and sharing. And let's go to our last caller tonight. Welcome to our Friday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
In the book of Galatians, can the number 14 be deducted from the year 2033? The part where Paul says, I know a man 14 years ago who was caught up into third heaven.
Which verse is that?
I don't have my Bible with me. It's probably like maybe chapter 3 of Galatians, I think. I think it's chapter 2 or something like that.
Okay, Galatians 2, verse 1, then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem. Is that the verse you mean? With Barnabas and took Titus with me?
I know a man 14 years ago who was caught up into third heaven.
I think that's 2 Corinthians. I don't know if that's in Galatians. But
well, if you're familiar with the verse, I was saying, like, there's the word caught up, like the rapture. What I'm saying is we're going to be here another 17 years. But if God shortened it 14 years, that's the question that I'm asking. Can that relate to the 14 years? Can that relate to a time path?
Oh, okay. No, I don't think so. One reason why we're looking at 2033 is the solid framework of the first coming of Christ and the same solid framework for the possible second coming of Christ as far as the end of the world goes. And it's just set up exactly the same. It's sort of like if you constructed a building over in another state, and you took the same building and put it in this state. It's amazing how similar the dates are, and yet spaced by 2,000 years. So, and we also have to keep in mind that the Bible points to two major epochs of time. 11 and 13. 11,000 and 13,000. Remember Joseph's dream. First, his 11 brothers bowed down to him. Then it was the 11 brothers and his mother and father. 13. There was 11 and then 13. And that the focus of the end of the world in the Bible is on 13. And all we have to do is look around and we see the apostate church, the condition of the world, and we know we're right on target. That especially when we review and we see it's like a completely different world. When you go back before 1988, look at the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, And now look at the 90s and the early 2000s and the decade we're in now. It's a completely different world as far as the sin that has multiplied and iniquity that has abounded across the face of the earth. And it matches the falling away of the church like never before in history, the multiplication of sin in the world so that they're losing sight of basic morality like never before in history, dovetails, it matches perfectly with the timeline for 13,000 years. And so that those are strong indicators you're on the right track. You're on the right track. And even when we look at our timeline and we saw that strong emphasis that was on 1994, that year, 1994, that Jubilee year. And now we're finding, well, that could have been the beginning point of an overarching 40-year period, inclusive, from 94 to 2033 AD, that would relate to the book of Jonah's yet 40 days, and Nineveh will be destroyed. It fits in very well, and if you take away 3 years, and you can't do that, there's nothing directing us to do that. You know, that we don't want to do things the Bible doesn't direct us to do. But if you were, then you're at 2030 AD, and there's no more similarity with the first coming of Christ. But thank you for calling and sharing. And I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight and for sharing your questions and comments, and especially the Bible verses we had an opportunity to read and consider. But we've come to the end of our time tonight. Please join us again, Lord willing, this coming Sunday afternoon during our online fellowship for another question and answer program. But for now, I'll say good night, and may the Lord's perfect will be done.
And thank you for joining us again for eBible Fellowship's Questions and Answers time with your speaker, Chris McCann. You can join us for these questions and answers sessions Sunday afternoons following the Sunday studies and certain weeknights following the Monday through Friday studies. Check eBibleFellowship.com for the current schedule. Until next time, may the Lord's perfect will be done.